agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. Happy belated Thanksgiving.
Yeah, same to you. You know, I've been looking forward to doing the show for you for a number of reasons, but one is that we are actually not planning on leading with impeachment, and what a relief. I don't know, in a way. I'm sure we'll be back as the lead story, but before we do get to our stories, I wanted to let folks know that, just a reminder that we have that new subreddit for our daily discussions, and we moved from Facebook just because, well, you know how Facebook is, Kristen. I mean, you spend a lot of your time on Facebook, and it just didn't feel like the right kind of forum for the sort of debate and discussion and conversation we were trying to put together. And so the Reddit, the subreddit actually is new, and it's kind of much lower key, much more. I think it's just kind of more civil and that sort of thing. I like it a lot, and it's just a brand new thing. There aren't a whole lot of people on it yet. We're trying to build up a community there. So if you are interested, all you have to do is just go to Reddit and type in a search for bipartisan politics, or you can just go to the link that we will put in the show notes. And there's not a whole lot of stuff there. We're not just trying to throw up content to be, viral or get people worked up. One or two things a day is about it. And I kind of like that pace. It's a nice change, I think. So,
yeah, definitely. Reddit, the spirit of Reddit, I think, is more along the lines of the spirit of the Politics Guys, if I dare say so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So with that out of the way, Kristen, do you want to lead us off here with our first story?
Sure. So, Mike and I, we were discussing, what story we were going to lead off with, because this week has been pretty slow news wise. But there have been some interesting things, which is kind of like you said, Mike, a nice break from the usual, we're all kind of getting impeachment fatigue on both sides, I guess. So this first story is no surprise. We're going to talk about Trump's trip to Afghanistan over Thanksgiving. So this past Thursday was Thanksgiving. And while many Americans traveled to see family and friends, and they gathered around the tables to eat turkey and tofurkey and all of the trimmings, reporters who followed the president on his travels gathered for a scheduled press conference at Mar-a-Lago, which was interesting. And President Trump had been in Florida for a few days. He was at a rally here in my home county of Broward County. The rally was actually about 5 minutes from my house. And then he was in Florida for this planned Thanksgiving vacation. And this is what the press thought. But the president, however, did not show up. Dun, dun, dun. By the time reporters found out that he and a small group of press folks and advisors had been in Afghanistan for Thanksgiving, Air Force One was already well on its way back to the United States. This was very interesting. And in case you were wondering about the details, you were busy this week, we understand. The visit was planned for weeks, but it had been kept under tight wraps, more so than most of his other official trips. And Trump served surprise servicemen and women Thanksgiving dinner at Bagram Air Force Base and made a rousing speech. And he also sat down with the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. So that is what the president was doing on Thanksgiving, a little different from what you and I were doing, probably. Yeah. But I don't know, any takeaways from that, Mike? Or?
Well, to me, the big thing was his President Trump's announcement that talks were back on between the U.S. and the Taliban, and these are the same talks that the president said were dead. Just less than actually 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what, if anything, has changed since then, and I still can't see the basis for any sort of a compromise. And here's why. So the Taliban wants us out of Afghanistan, and they don't recognize the legitimacy of the current Afghanistan government, which they see as a U.S. puppet regime. So why does the Taliban want us out? Obviously, because they want it to be easier for their ability to assert reassert control over Afghanistan. And of course, the U.S. wants to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't become more of a breeding ground, safe haven for terrorists, which obviously was a huge problem, why we were there in the first place. So, I mean, I don't see what the compromise here is, right? I mean, the Taliban, sure, maybe they agree to a ceasefire, but the Taliban's an Islamic fundamentalist movement that, believes in jihad. So they're going to, agree to a ceasefire. We're going to leave, and they're going to break the ceasefire because that their whole point of being is to wage jihad and, have that sort of Sharia law in and take over in that area. So I don't understand how this would possibly work. So maybe you could say, well, the Taliban and Donald Trump want the same thing, as they both want the U.S. out of Afghanistan. But aside from that, it could be a short-term, I guess, rhetorical victory for President Trump, saying, I got the troops out of Afghanistan. But longer term, it seems to me it's completely to the detriment of the United States. And so I don't see the point of any of this. I guess it's the only point I can see is it's a photo op for the president, and that's about it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I have a lot of friends who are, I would call them more hawkish Republicans. And I have a lot of friends who are more libertarian leaning Republicans. And there's this big ideological divide in my party over whether or not we get the troops out of any foreign conflict. And certainly Afghanistan is front and center. And I have debates with my husband constantly about this because he is of the mindset that, yes, we pull the troops out. And at the risk of sounding like I'm stuck in the middle, which is frequently more and more where I find myself in terms of party ideology, I too have some reservations with, I guess, negotiating a ceasefire, because I think on one hand, you've had this war in Afghanistan. It's been going on for 18 years, which is like a staggering number of years when I think back to like what I was doing 18 years ago, how different things were and how different the world looked. Right now we have, I think it was 12,000 troops that remain in Afghanistan, which is less than there were. But we've also, in 18 years, we've seen 2,400 Americans killed since 2001 in Afghanistan. So there's a big part of me that says I completely understand this notion that, maybe it's time to end this war. Maybe it's time to broker a deal. That being said, and, I'll leave that right there. I think it could be terribly problematic pulling the troops out, because then you create this power vacuum, which is a little, it's what you mentioned. The Taliban will come in. Obviously, they want the U.S. to leave. And so this is kind of, eventually this will fall in their favor if they're able to get more of a stronghold there. So, this is very tricky, and I would venture to say that I have mixed opinions about it, but I guess I'm not surprised that this is when it was announced. He's in front of a friendly audience. He's in front of the troops, and they're going to applaud whatever he says. So, the fact that he met with the Afghan president, I think it's like you said, a great photo op. Whether or not it's going to move the ball in one direction or the other, I don't know. I guess you could say, what's the harm in negotiating? But then what is the end game? If the end game is pulling these troops out of Afghanistan, then that could create a real problem. And that's something that a lot of high-level military officials have warned against over the years, especially regarding the Taliban.
Yeah. Well, I think negotiations only make sense if both sides have something that they agree that they want. And our end game aims are, it seems to me, irreconcilable. And I don't see the basis for any negotiation. In fact, I would argue that our stance, we should look at Afghanistan in the same way we looked at, say, Europe after World War II, and that we have to understand that this is a generations long commitment. And it doesn't have to be a huge financially ruinous commitment. Under 10,000 troops will probably be more than enough. But the fact of the matter is that poor, corrupt countries are always going to be an inviting place for terrorists. And we can't wish that away. We can't just leave and close our eyes and hope for the best, because we know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So if I were in the president's position, I would not only promise to keep a robust troop presence in Afghanistan as long as it's needed, I would also try to work out a treaty with Afghanistan that actually formalizes that. And because, treaties require a supermajority of the Senate and they actually override laws if they're in conflict, that gives that a sort of real legitimacy. Because right now, all we have with Afghanistan is this bilateral security agreement, which means like basically next to nothing, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I would actually double down on our commitment, because I think, and I understand, more libertarian folks would disagree, but I think we have an important role to play here in the world. And one of my biggest problems with the Trump foreign policy has been just this idea that we can withdraw from the world and just hope that other people will pick up the slack. And other people will pick up the slack. Russia, the Taliban, mm-hmm. the sort of people we don't want picking up the slack. And so I think the Trump foreign policy has been, generally speaking, pretty bad. And that for that exact reason, that he wants to, it seems to me, go in exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, it also seems to me, and I agree with you for the most part. I think in the past, we've had a legacy of, doubling down on our, I don't want to say occupation, but our presence in these countries. And I can't think, I'm thinking back to like the last 18 years, since 9/11, I can't think of a situation where we withdrew from a country and things ended well. Yeah. And I think that, I really cannot think of a situation like that. And I too think of Europe after World War I and World War II, what not to do versus what to do. And obviously it's a huge monetary commitment. It's a huge commitment for, our armed forces. It is still putting them in harm's way. I mean, Afghanistan is still considered an active combat zone, so it is a dangerous situation. But I would agree with you that I can't think of a situation where we withdrew carte blanche and things ended up well. Yeah. I think Syria, there was an announcement that we were going to withdraw, and things ended up well for now, but that still hasn't happened yet. So I can't really look at Syria and say, okay, there's an example of when that went well.
I mean, when you're fighting non-state actors who
right.
are deeply committed to what they're doing. And so this is, in a sense, I think this is just Donald Trump this is being an old boomer kind of guy attitude, saying that you could just, withdraw and it's okay. This isn't World War II, which is really the last time that we just kind of were able to just sort of go home and everything was okay. But we were dealing with, with states we were fighting. And, even in Korea, right? We've been in Korea in a big way,
right, since
the 1950s. So that's the new reality of this. And we can like it or not, it doesn't matter, but we can't just pretend it. We can't just pretend it away. And that seems to me to be the basis of this foreign policy. And I just think it's completely wrong-headed.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this goes the way that I want it to go. I just, I can't help but think of, I don't know if you do you listen to Serial, Mike, the podcast Serial?
I have listened to it in the past.
Yeah. So season 2, it's funny because season 1 got all the fanfare and It was a wonderful season. And of course it got a lot of people into podcasting, which is great. Of course we're biased, but season 2 was all about the Bo Bergdahl situation. And it's funny because I've like fiercely defended that season as the best season. I know a lot of people, disagreed with me and said, "Oh, I like season 1 better." I preferred season 2. And one of the things that I credit that season for doing, I approached it with an open mind. I know how I felt about Bo Bergdahl. My feelings about him and what he did haven't really changed. But one of the things that season did was they were interviewing these higher level military officials and these people who are on the ground in Afghanistan in particular. And it really changed my mind as to staying involved and having a presence in these countries. Because before that, I had taken a much more libertarian approach for some time. Yes, pull them out. We got to get the troops home. Listening to that and listening to these higher level military officials say, no, that's not how this works. I mean, we're involved, in these conflicts and in this war. And it's something, I guess it brought some level of understanding because I haven't been on the ground in Afghanistan. I don't know how things work there, but it brought this whole new perspective of like, we can't even get into the heads of these insurgents and our enemies here because it's not what we would consider to be rational. It's a whole other mindset.
Right.
And so, I think that's important. It's an important thing to remember going into something like this. And I can't help but think about Serial season 2 when I heard about President Trump talking about this while he was on the ground at Bagram Air Force Base. Just kind of like this, do we really know who we're dealing with here? We're not dealing with these legitimate state actors, like you said. The world has changed. Terrorism has changed. This is unfamiliar territory. And like I said before, I can't think of a situation where that worked out for us in the last 15 years.
Yeah.
So.
Especially when our allies are weak and corrupt. And that's just, Afghanistan's government is that exactly. And we can't change that ourselves easily either, without the work of, again, generations.
Sure. So anyway, any other thoughts on Trump's trip to Afghanistan? I guess that was the big the big news story of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we move on?
Yes, let's.
Okay. So the next story is something, I don't know about you, Mike. I've been dying to talk about this because it's an international story, and it's something I've talked about a lot with like-minded and not like-minded friends, but I'm glad we get to talk about it here. So this has to do with Trump signing the Hong Kong support legislation earlier this week. So hopefully we haven't all been living under rocks, but the protests in Hong Kong began in this last June, which surprised me. It feels like they haven't been going on this long, but they really have. And this was all over a bill that would have allowed criminal suspects in Hong Kong to be extradited to China in some situations. And so these freedom-seeking protesters have revolted. And they obviously are very upset. The violence has escalated. So elected officials and citizens here in the U.S. have been watching these protests with a lot of interest. I know I have. While some believe that supporting the protesters would harm our relationship with China, others saw this as an opportunity to help those who fight for freedom over communist governments. So, in all of this, the Hong Kong police have been granted quite a bit of power from Beijing when it comes to quelling the protests, and plenty of viral videos are showing chaos and violence. It's gotten pretty out of control. So after quite a bit of speculation as to whether or not he'd support the legislation, this past Wednesday, President Trump signed 2 bills. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act initiates sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials who commit abuses of human rights and would subject Hong Kong to an annual review in order to hang on to that nice little trade relationship they have with the U.S. And the second bill prohibits exporting non-lethal munitions, which includes things like tear gas, tasers, rubber bullets, stun guns, stuff like that, and more to the Hong Kong police. And of course, China is not very happy about this. But the legislation did gain massive bipartisan support, which is worth talking about. And there was one lone holdout, which I was interesting to find out it was.
Yeah, Thomas Massey.
Thomas Massey, who we interviewed. So I thought that was very interesting. He was the lone holdout. So I don't know, what's your take on all this, Mike?
Well, apparently on Massey, I heard an interview. He said that basically he voted against it because he thought the sanctions were more or less a bluff and that we wouldn't follow through on them. But so or maybe, I don't know, he just wanted to be the lone guy out. He does love being out there on his own. So,
yes.
But more generally, there was some talk last week that the president might actually veto that measure. We knew it was going to pass, and pretty clearly he realized, I think, that this would be a veto that would most likely be overridden, and no one, that would make him look pretty weak. But then I thought about it in a couple ways. Now, because obviously the president's main focus here, the president has made it pretty clear that he doesn't care a whole lot about human rights as an issue. He's just, you could look at the Khashoggi thing, you could look at all sorts of other instances, in the Philippines and other places. His attitude pretty much just seems to be, let them do whatever they want in their countries. We're just concerned about making the best deal for us. And okay, I find that, while I may find that morally reprehensible, I get it, certainly. And so I was trying to think, well, how might the president see this in terms of helping him negotiate an end to the trade war with China? And potentially you could say that, well, now the president can use the possibility of these congressionally approved sanctions and changing that special trade status of Hong Kong as a bargaining chip. And certainly he's not adverse to using, cracking down on human rights as leverage. I don't think he cares about it in and of itself, but as a means to an end, I think that totally fits with his completely transactional style of politics.
Yeah. So it's interesting, just going back to the Massey thing, because I'm not surprised at all that he was the lone holdout in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, I think it was unanimous support in the Senate, which also doesn't surprise me. But one of the things that I found interesting is that you said that, that Thomas Massey gave an explanation of why he voted against this. I actually heard multiple explanations that he gave. One of them was that we already had legislation in the books regarding things like this, which is something that he's brought up before. He doesn't like new legislation. It's a very libertarian approach to creating legislation that doesn't need to be created because it's already been created, sort of a thing. The other thing that I've heard, and this was a more critical view, and this was something that I think a lot of, sometimes I get into the weeds with stuff and I read these like crazy sort of conspiracy theory blogs. And on the left, there were a couple of prominent bloggers who mentioned the fact that his voting record tends to align with our Chinese and Russian interests more than other representatives, let's just say. I mean, obviously they expressed this in a much less kind way.
Yeah.
But, there was also that. And he did talk about in a radio interview in Kentucky, the fact that this was back when, Trump was wavering. Should I sign it? Should I not sign it? He sort of voiced the concerns about this ongoing trade negotiation, these trade talks with China, and how this might, impede all of that and put a damper on that. So I heard, there were multiple explanations, which, I mean, again, I don't find any of that surprising, especially with Massey. But I also understand President Trump's concern. I think that, that he has this really good relationship with China and, with the Chinese president. And I think that I think he knew the consequences of doing something like this. But at the same time, I have to wonder if the Chinese expected him to do something else. I mean, like you said, this easily would have been overturned. All it needs is a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to overturn a presidential veto. So it would have easily been overturned. I think Trump's hand was forced. I don't think he had a choice. But from the beginning, he has said that he supported, he said, we stand with Hong Kong. We stand with Hong Kong. I don't think there are too many people who are rational people on the right or the left that don't understand what the protesters are fighting for. I mean, I stand with those protesters 100%. But, another thing that I think is interesting is that the Hong Kong protesters were invoking President Trump. I mean, they were parading around with that photoshopped picture of him on Rocky Balboa's body, and they've been holding up Trump signs and American flag signs. So they've been really almost like pandering to him.
You can't go wrong. Appealing to President Trump's ego as a general rule.
I was just going to say that. I found that very interesting because I haven't seen much of that. There are protests going on. It's funny because we're so wrapped up in impeachment, like you said. And so, we kind of forget that there are these like freedom centric protests going on all over the world. And there is, these violent protests, and few other places have invoked President Trump and have tried to appeal to his vanity quite like these protesters in Hong Kong. So I think that's an interesting angle too. But I'm not surprised that he signed this legislation. And I personally think that he needed to. I think this was important to send a message, if nothing else, to China, because largely they've kind of been going haywire. The Chinese government has really overstepped its bounds. I mean, the interesting thing about Hong Kong is that it's considered a one country, I think it's like one country, two systems type of a scenario. And so, they're supposed to have I think they're supposed to have like this sovereign judicial system. They're supposed to have freedom of expression more so than people in mainland China. And all of that's sort of being chipped away at by the Chinese government. And so I understand their fears. I think this legislation is the right thing to do. I support it.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think, the reason why China hasn't just completely cracked down on this is because they understand how important Hong Kong is. I mean, not maybe directly, if you looked at, GDP and size of economy and all that sort of thing, but an awful lot of, in fact, the majority of China's foreign investment goes through Hong Kong, and in large part, because of those freedoms, is that investors have that confidence in their legal system. And when you have a party-run system where rule of law is subordinate to the wishes of the parties, like in mainland China, that's the kind of thing that makes it more difficult for international investors to go in with confidence. And that's why in the end, and I think this is a very sort of old school anti-communist argument, that those sort of systems are just bound to not work out in the end. And China, I think, is really struggling to try to balance those things. It doesn't want to, give up its control, but it also understands that it can't just be isolated from the system. And that's the battle. That's the larger battle that we're having, right? Is China wants it both ways. They want to be able to do all the intellectual property theft that they want. They want to impose these draconian rules on anyone who comes into the country, and to a certain extent they can because they have such a large domestic market. But in the end, that's not how the game can work. And I have a certain amount of sympathy for the Trump administration in its push to say, well, we need to do something about this now. And I think the international community has been far too willing to let China go and to give in to China just because it happens to be such a big market. And so in that sense, I like what the Trump administration is trying to do, and I think it's worth a little bit of short-term sacrifice. I only disagree with the methodology, and I think the way to do this is the way that someone like a George H.W. Bush would have done it, is by getting together an international coalition, and that would make it a lot stronger and a lot more, I think, legitimate than the way the president is doing it.
Mm-hmm. And to sort of touch on what you just said, I think it's really tough to understand how much of Chinese GDP is wrapped up in Hong Kong. Yeah. I mean, I read a couple of articles about it last night just to try to get some numbers. 9% of China's GDP is wrapped up in the assets in the Hong Kong market. It's over $1 trillion. So losing Hong Kong would be devastating for the country of China, and it would destabilize a lot of things. But, also China, we can't forget China's trying to globalize their currency. They're trying to catch up with the U.S. in terms of, the U.S. dollar has sort of become a global currency. And I think they're trying to catch up. But like you said, they can't have it both ways. I mean, I can count on two hands the number of people over the years I've had conversations with who, I'll start talking about China and they'll say, well, China's not really communist. It's not really socialist. Yeah. And I'll say, yes, it is. Yeah. And I point to situations like this. It's in those moments. I mean, sure, they have this burgeoning market and you can travel there and these things that we're not used to hearing about from communist countries. I mean, I live, at a short plane ride away from Cuba. I've been there before. I studied abroad in Cuba, and that is, in every sense of the word, definitively a communist country on lockdown. China's not like that. But China also, with these protests in Hong Kong, we've seen that they've given this absurd amount of power to the police in Hong Kong. I mean, they're beating these protesters to a pulp, and they're doing these atrocious things. And also, the concern over this bill is that they would be extraditing and possibly jailing people like activists, journalists, these people that are essential for the cause of freedom in Hong Kong. I mean, so we are, like you said, we're really caught. And I too sympathize with the Trump administration. This is very tricky because the destabilized China could be, very dangerous, but then also, not standing by people who are fighting against communism for the purpose of freedom is also just completely counterintuitive to everything we stand for.
Yeah. And the Chinese government just has, some big problems with trying to maintain. I mean, they can't maintain the sort of record growth that they've been generating. And so there are concerns about economic slowdowns. And of course, the whole Hong Kong thing plays into that in a big way. And the fact that as they have more people that are more materially well off, then they start to care about things like freedom of expression and stuff like that when they're not worried about just subsistence level sort of living.
Right.
And so this is, I mean, I certainly am concerned about China, as I think most people should be, as a strategic threat to the United States. But they have, you look 10, 15 years out even, and they have just enormous problems that they have to deal with. And they really have a tiger by the tail here, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So before we move on, Kristen, I just wanted to thank some of our new supporters in this last week. There's Laura, who made a generous contribution to the show through PayPal, and she wrote, "Thank you for all you do to bring bipartisan discussion to current politics and policy." And thank you, Laura. We really appreciate it. And we'd also like to thank Josh, who increased his monthly support, as well as new supporters Peter, Garrett, and Timothy. And Timothy wrote, "I saw the promotion for a mug or tote bag at the $5 level this week and signed right up." And Timothy's referring to our that Black Friday deal thing we did, where all listeners who became supporters at the $5 a month level, including current supporters who raised their support to that level, got either a Politics Guys mug or tote bag, which normally is at the $10 per month or higher level. And, you know, Kristen, initially we planned on just ending this today, but I thought, we're actually releasing this show before Cyber Monday. I don't know if that's even a thing, but it's probably a thing somewhere. I don't know. It all runs together in my mind now. But I thought that we'll let it run for one more week. So if you want to get yourself a Politics Guys mug or tote bag, now is the time to do it. And, you know, I don't know if they'd make perfect Christmas gifts, but, you know, what the heck? Sure, let's give it to someone, you know, that you love or like or just, I don't know, feel indifferent about. Anyway.
Secret Santa, maybe?
There you go. You know,
Santa, it's perfect for something like that.
Yes, definitely. And again, that's for anyone who becomes or moves up to being a Patreon supporter at only the $5 or more per month level. And that's also the level at which you get our weekly Politics Guys quick take. And of course, everyone who's a supporter gets the bonus show. And to find out, to sign up for all that, you just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can just go to politicsguys.com/support. Thanks so much. All right. So what do we have next, Kristen?
All right. So the next story we're going to talk about, it's going to be it's going to be hard to not get into the weeds with this one because it's so complicated. But last Saturday, Trey and Ken, I believe, discussed the pardons of the 3 servicemen by the Trump administration. It was Army First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence, Army Major Matthew Goldstein, and Special Warfare Operator Chief Eddie Gallagher. And of course, what we're talking about today involves the last of those men. So they went into a lot of detail about the circumstances surrounding the pardons. If you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend that you do. I listened to it twice just because I was interested in that particular conversation. And since then, there's been a major development. Navy Secretary Richard Spencer has been fired as a result of this. So earlier this week, stories were clashing. At the center of it all is Chief Petty Officer Gallagher, who's a veteran SEAL. His rank was restored by President Trump after the Navy demoted him. So there was quite a bit of talk, sort of 3 different stories going on regarding his firing. Trump said that the decision to Spencer fire was about his leadership, and he came right out of the box saying that. And then there was Mark Esper, who told reporters that Spencer had gone behind his and others' backs to broker a deal with the White House to ensure that Gallagher would keep his SEAL status. So this kind of had to do with insubordination. And he said that Spencer contradicted his own public statements and his agreement with senior officials. And of course, I guess in a splashier way, Spencer then hit back with an op-ed in the Washington Post, which we'll discuss. And the big takeaway from all of this is that these senior military officials, former Navy Secretary Richard Spencer and President Trump sort of all have these conflicting stories, and there seem to be problems with all 3. And that's, I guess, what we're going to get into today, as opposed to the actual pardon. Yeah. So I guess, you know, what did you make of all this? Did you read I assume you read the op-ed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. I did.
So did you believe what Richard Spencer or did you believe what he had to say? Did you think it was like cognitive dissonance? Did you think it was a disgruntled former employee? I mean, what was your take? Because everybody seems to have a different take on that op-ed.
Well, I get what Spencer was trying to do, to keep the president out of the process as much as he possibly could. And I think that's a smart, that's a good thing to shoot for. But it's pretty clear to me that he was wrong to work around his superiors. And there's no way that he couldn't have known that. So if he wanted to keep the president out of things, then he should have done that in consultation with Esper, with Secretary of Defense Esper. And he,
Right.
he decided that there had to be a reason for that, because there's no way that this guy who, was in the distant past a Marine, understands the military culture and so forth. He understands chain of command. He knows that this was essentially a fireable offense. And that to me suggests that maybe he thought that if he brought in Esper wouldn't support him in this, or there was some kind of internal politics going on. I don't know. But Spencer I think his ends were right. And I think President Trump was pretty clearly wrong to intervene. I thought Ken did a great job in making that case last week. And to me, it's not so much about the rank. The president sure can say, restore a rank to anyone or promote people. The president has awfully wide discretion when it comes to the military. But the right to wear that trident is about the confidence that a person's fellow SEALs have in the guy who's with them. And it's just as wrong for the president to prevent the trident from being pulled as it would be for the president just unilaterally to say, hey, my driver, yes, he's a SEAL as of today. Now, he could legally do that. There's nothing that prevents him from doing that, really, but that doesn't make it right. So the president's intervention in this is, I think, as Ken, very well pointed out, is a slap in the face to the military, because that President Trump doesn't care about the military. He had a chance to join the military, and apparently he had some convenient bone spurs that kept him out. I mean, it's all about the president feeling he's being disrespected or something like that. And the president was played by Gallagher's folks who understood how to manipulate him. Donald Trump is just so incredibly easy to manipulate. It's sad, really, in a way, how pathetically easy he is to manipulate, because he's so emotionally immature, I guess. But this is just another example of this to me.
Well, I obviously have a slightly different take on it.
I thought you might.
So my thought process, just in the interest of full disclosure, I know a handful of people who are involved with the Free Eddie Gallagher movement. A lot of them live in South Florida. I've gotten to know them through, politics. A lot of them were involved in politics before, Republican politics. So, all of that aside, my own feelings about what Gallagher did, and, I guess the ruling, the rulings on his charges, all of those feelings aside, this whole situation with the presidential pardon brought me back to, I think it was 2017 with Chelsea Manning. And I remember hearing that President Obama had earlier commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. And I think, I had a lot of conflicting feelings. This is something that Obama had done a couple times during his presidency, where he commuted sentences. He got involved in these military tribunal type matters. And I thought it was an overstep. And I also think that President Trump probably should have left this to the court-martial process, because I think that, anytime a president gets involved on the behalf of, a serviceman or a servicewoman in something like this, maybe he's not letting the court-martial process play out. It is kind of a slap in the face to the military. That being said, and I have some reservations. Was it right? Was it wrong? I'm not really sure. I wasn't there, but I think that the most important takeaway from all this is that Spencer did flout the chain of command. There was a breach in the chain of command. I I understand of the three stories, the one that I'm most inclined to believe is Secretary of Defense Esper's story, which is that this is something that's been, he talked quite a bit about this being in the works for a while. They were unhappy with Spencer. It's sort of a situation, and we've all seen this happen, in various workplaces where somebody just isn't doing their job. You've got a lot of anger, you've got a lot of, bad feelings towards somebody. And all of a sudden, you're in this situation where they do something that's just maybe a little more egregious, and you use that as the reason to fire them. So, of course, this all could have gone away quickly over, he could have been summarily exited during Thanksgiving week without a lot of fanfare and without a lot of news coverage because it's Thanksgiving week. And that's what everybody's, focused on. But that's not what happened. And I think that's the only reason why this made as big a splash as it did, was it was over this like very controversial Eddie Gallagher pardon. And but the bottom line is that I think that the right decision was made. I think that Spencer had to go. And of the three, the story I believe is probably Esper's story. And I do think that Spencer's op-ed in the Washington Post, I do think it's an example of somebody being wronged by the Trump administration, running to the Washington Post or like the New York Times or, MSNBC and, getting upset. I kind of saw it as a disgruntled employee who was still very emotionally invested in this and was very emotional about his firing. President Trump's story didn't seem to make sense, either in light of everything. So I think maybe this was justified.
Yeah, I agree. And in that op-ed, he did say that he was wrong to work around the Secretary of Defense. And I think he made some reasonable points. But again, this to me, the larger picture here is we've seen an awful lot of turnover in the Trump administration. And in part, I wonder the extent to which it's because the best people don't want to be associated with the Trump administration. And I certainly, I know that there are plenty of establishment Republicans who feel that way. And so it might be harder for the president to get the best people. Not only that, but given how erratic the man is, I think it's awful hard to instill a culture of loyalty and respect when the commander-in-chief seems to have almost no loyalty or respect to anything except for his own political fortunes and adulation of the masses. And so the president's supposed to lead by example, and I think the example has been just uniformly poor from the president.
And you mentioned establishment Republicans. I guess because a lot of times I find myself understanding what establishment Republicans, what their objections are. And a lot of times I find myself not understanding what their objections are and siding more with Trump. But, I can't see a situation. I know a handful of establishment, Republican types, both former elected officials, current elected officials, and also just supporters who are, I guess they would be given that dubious title of rhino. Republican in name only. I don't know that that's who Donald Trump is trying to surround himself with. He does like yes men, as most presidents have shown that they do. They value loyalty. He tends to value it maybe a little more than most. But I don't know that that's what he's going for. But I think this is kind of an example and a reflection of that. You had somebody who breached the chain of command.
Sure.
This was probably an excuse to get rid of him, and he probably needed to go. So I guess I don't see the controversy, and my guess is that Spencer's op-ed will and it has garnered quite a bit of attention in various media outlets, and then it'll kind of fade away.
Yeah,
the next hot and heavy news story comes along.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So shall we move on to the final? Perhaps. Okay. This is a really interesting one, and I'm glad we chose to talk about it. So this involves the FDA issuing warning letters on CBD products, which are very popular right now. So with all the interest in CBD products lately, it's no wonder that the FDA made some headlines this week with warnings about CBD. So I'm taking this right from the FDA website because I went to the source to see exactly what they said about it. They said the FDA is working to answer questions about the science, safety, and quality of products containing cannabis and cannabis-derived compounds, particularly CBD. So then if you go to the FDA website, they have a whole laundry list of of problems they have with CBD, questions. They mentioned that they've only approved one CBD product, which is a CBD drug that is used to treat epilepsy. So that is the only FDA approved topic. But I mean, if you look at the website, there's a whole list of possible side effects, medical questions. The testing is still ongoing. It can, they mentioned that CBD can cause liver injury. It can affect metabolism. If used with alcohol, it can affect your nervous system. Obviously it affects your alertness. So, I don't know. I know you had some thoughts about this, Mike.
Well, yeah, this is such a weird story because, I mean, this goes back to 2018, because in the 2018 Farm Bill, Congress made hemp legal. And so what people took away from that is that all hemp-derived products were also legal. And then we saw just CBD businesses spring out of nowhere to where in some areas you can't, they're like every other street corner practically, and all over the place online. But early this year, the FDA issued a clarification indicating that CBD actually isn't legal to sell, though possession isn't illegal. And the reason why, and this is such a weird thing, because the FDA has this designation called generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, GRAS. CBD is not generally recognized as safe, so it can't be used as an additive in food or drink. And of course, there are CBD gummies and all the additives all over the place. That's not legal. CBD is also an FDA-approved drug, as you mentioned, for that rare form of epilepsy. So it can't then be marketed or sold as a supplement, because it's like taking, any other normal, drug that you have to get a prescription for, and just taking another form of it and saying you can just sell it because you opened up a store. I mean, you can't do that with a heart drug or any other kind of drug. You can't do it with CBD as well. So, but even though it's illegal, people are selling it all over the place. And, the FDA basically chose these 15 organizations to send out letters to, because they couldn't send out letters to the, gazillion places that are selling it. But the letters essentially are, hey, this is illegal. You can't be doing this. And so that's just so bizarre to me, because right now you could go and buy CBD, no problem. And that to me just illustrates how these regulatory agencies may have enforcement authority, and these things may be illegal, but unless they actually have the ability to do this enforcement, unless there's the political will to do it, well, it's not going to happen. And this is exactly the case that we're seeing with the FDA, because it doesn't have the resources to shut down all of these CBD sellers. And so to me, even the bigger picture here is you pull back and just look at just the wild west of the supplement industry. I mean, it's like a $40 billion industry, and you don't know what you're getting in most of this stuff because there is no regulation. And to me, this is just a travesty. And this is an area where I think that maybe there should be some bipartisan agreement that regulating the safety of pills that people put into their bodies, whether they're prescription or not, maybe there's a legitimate role for government there.
Yeah. It's funny because last night I was walking around a little town center with my family, and we walked into GNC to buy some protein bars for lunches for the week for my husband and I. And they were advertising all over the place CBD. I mean, it is everywhere. It's even at places like GNC. There was a pizza restaurant, and this was a whole big commotion in the city where I live, but there was a pizza restaurant that was putting CBD in pizza crust. And so they were advertising it with big pot leaves, all over the glass. And I agree with you. I think that the system that we have now is clearly not working. I mean, it reminds me of the diet pill industry. It also reminds me of this sort of state by state, almost county by county rollout of medical marijuana, recreational marijuana. I mean, it's different from county to county, state to state. There's been a lot of talk. I know CBD has been a really big issue in Texas, where some counties have been cracking down on these like nutrition supplement stores, these, private mom and pop businesses that are selling CBD products. And the question is, can you make claims? If you make claims, what types of claims can you make? What will they help? I mean, CBD is one of those things that affects everybody differently. And of course, there are varying levels of THC in CBD. You can have, CBD that has negligible amounts of THC, and then there's a whole spectrum of CBD, and a lot of times you don't know what you're getting. And so, I know we talked about in a previous episode months back, the regulation of the aviation industry. And we kind of both agreed that it was really problematic, that the aviation industry wasn't regulated to the extent that maybe it should be, but we understood both sides. And I think this is one of those situations where, I full disclosure, again, I've used CBD products. I've used CBD cream. If I have a bad back, I've used it on my back. I've not, used CBD recreationally. I've not, ingested it, but, I know that CBD can be helpful, especially for people with chronic pain, stuff like that. But not having the peace of mind to walk into a store knowing what you're getting is really problematic. And it seems to me that no matter, state by state, county by county, I guess if these federal agencies or these, local police or whatever, if they want to get involved and they want to start regulating this, the problem is almost too widespread. And this is exactly what's happened with, this campaign for medicinal marijuana and also for recreational marijuana, is it becomes almost impossible. You have to cross county lines because county by county, state by state, it's regulated differently. And this is kind of the problem that we're running into with CBD. But man, it is everywhere. Like you said, it's unavoidable.
It's amazing how it went just from nothing to just, like you said, everywhere. And to me, I would love to see a system where the FDA had a pretty significant testing division, and that there would be a requirement that all supplements be submitted for testing and approval. And then every supplement would have to list either that they're FDA approved or not FDA approved prominently on the label. So that I could almost see this as a compromise, not saying that, this has been on the market for a while and so forth, but an idea that there is like a testing standard where that way any normal person could go in and say, oh, on the label, this says not FDA approved, so I'm taking my chances. On the other hand, this one says FDA approved, so I at least know what I'm getting. So I'm not saying that necessarily the government should say, you can't, a much heavier regulatory hand, but I would like to think there would at least be some kind of a compromise along those lines. And I would pay for that testing with a tax on the vitamin and supplement industry. And of course they would fight, it's a fascinating story how in the mid 90s, they basically just really pushed super hard for this legislation that would allow them to do really whatever the hell they wanted.
The Fen scandal.
It was,
I remember this.
And it just, it's just how many people are not just throwing away their money, but potentially just doing harm to themselves, because we've seen these exposés where, there's independent testing and it finds out that there's massively more amounts or massively less.
Yeah.
So at least people should have the confidence that they know what they're getting, or that somebody who they can trust has tested this. And we don't have this in this industry. And that's a huge problem, I think. And this is an area where government can step in and actually do some good.
Yeah, I read a really interesting article. I believe it was put out by the Mercatus, and I can't really remember where I read it, but it was one of the arguments that was made is that the FDA standard should be applied to itself, which kind of goes along with what you were saying. So I guess I took that to mean that the agency needs to be held accountable if, whatever regulation they're issuing doesn't achieve the desired result. So the FDA doesn't consider trade-offs and, risk for risk testing and stuff like that. If they issue a letter like this, let's say, and they're not considering the trade-offs with, regulating, making CBD illegal, and they're not considering, the trade-offs and the risks involved or the, the risks that aren't actually there. There's really no explanation of that in these letters. And so they should be held to the same standard, and they should be required to report all of this. Because if you go to the FDA website, they say things in very, I guess, lawyerly terms. CBD can cause liver injury. CBD can affect the metabolism of other drugs. CBD can, if you use it with alcohol, it can affect your central nervous system. But I feel like there's not enough testing, and this standard hasn't been applied to their own studies. They say they're going to continue to study this, and they're going to continue to look into this, but we have no guarantees. And I think your solution of putting, having companies put directly on the label whether or not something is FDA approved is probably a pretty good compromise. Because we do need that assurance that what we're taking, we don't necessarily need to know that it will work, but we need to know that it at least what's in it, what the possible side effects are, what the risks of taking something like this are, which is exactly what happened in the diet pill industry. And it's what we're finding is happening now with marijuana, you know?
Exactly.
Because you don't know what you're getting. You don't know what it's laced with. When I bought CBD cream for my back, I tried a little bit of it. I was very wary. I did a lot of research, but in the end, I don't know what was in it. I don't use it anymore, but, I didn't know what was in it. I was taking a calculated risk. And, but I knew the details. I knew the policy behind it. I knew that it was not something that was sanctioned by the FDA. But a lot of people turn to these drugs. I can't tell you how many people talk about CBD, like it's this miracle substance,
Well,
and you don't know what you're getting.
And that's part of the larger argument that I sometimes have with my much more libertarian friends, saying that, if everyone were more like you, and if people were rational and did their homework like you did, Kristen, then we wouldn't have to have this regulation, because people would say, well, you know what, this hasn't been tested, and I did some research, and this so-called third-party testing is paid for by them, and so there's a conflict. And those are all the things that people of really good critical thinking skills and a lot of education can do. But most people aren't in that position. They're going to be a lot more subject to be manipulated by the marketing. They're not going to be able to do the research. And so they're the ones who are going to end up being hurt. And those are the people we need to protect.
Right. Agree.
All right. Well, on that note of agreement, maybe we should, and we're not going to end, because actually, as soon as we're done recording this show, we're going to be doing our special bonus show just for supporters. We're going to do something fun again. You remember, Kristen, a while back, we took a test, a little quiz together, actually.
I liked it. I thought it was fun.
Yeah, we're going to do the same thing this week, except it's a quiz about, it aligns you based on, 18 questions or 10, I don't know how many questions, that aligns you with all of the top 10 Democratic candidates. And so we're going to see which candidates I should be supporting and which would maybe be least objectionable to Kristen, I guess we could say.
I haven't looked at it yet. I haven't even gone to the site. So I have my guesses, but we shall see. I think
it's going to be a lot of fun. And also the quick take this week, and that's for supporters at the $5 a month level or more, is Trey. And Trey is talking about why you shouldn't be concerned or afraid of lobbyists. And I haven't heard that yet. And so I am deeply skeptical about this. And so I am very curious to hear what this is all about. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you are a supporter, it should be in your podcast app by the time you're hearing this. And of course, we have a bunch of other supporter things at various levels, and you can find out all about it by going to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/politicsguys, or just going to politicsguys.com/support. And if you just want to get in touch with us, mail@politicsguys.com. There's also that bipartisan politics subreddit that I mentioned, reddit.com/r/bipartisanpolitics, or just search for bipartisan politics on Reddit, or just, go to the URL that I'll have in the show notes. And then there's our Facebook page where we announce new episodes and that sort of thing. And we're on Twitter @PoliticsGuys. If you're not yet a subscriber to the show, it would really help us if you did subscribe, but that costs you literally nothing. So please do that in whatever podcast app you use. And if you could rate us and say nice things about us, that would be great as well. We really appreciate it. The executive producer of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show is produced by Krista Matheny and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.